Now, on previous videos on my channel, I've talked about emulation, and I've talked about how my cat Moss loves the table, loves the cables, loves the devices I've got, loves this room, and just likes to generally walk. Good old Moss. And yes, it is Moss from the IT crowd. I am that sad, of course. So on previous videos on my channel, I've talked about emulation and how it's actually a good way of playing video games, especially retro video games from systems of years gone by. So the Sega Master System, the Nintendo Entertainment System, Sega Mega Drive or Genesis, Super Nintendo / Super Famicom, and also home computer systems from the 80s. It gives you a way of playing them games without having to have a collection of hardware and software lying around. And that's despite the fact that I've got quite a big collection of retro consoles and also retro games. But it is nice sometimes to just kick back with a controller, having a system that's emulating a whole bunch of games and that I can jump between different systems and different games. And that's where systems like these Raspberry Pi devices, these single board computers, come into play. I've got the Raspberry Pi 3B here, which I've had for a good few years now. And in fairly recent times, I picked up the Raspberry Pi 4B. Now, these can be loaded with something called RetroPie, which is a really nice distribution of, I think it's the Raspbian OS, and it's got a front end called Emulation Station on it, which is really nice, and it's customizable, so you can have some nice themes on there. And running behind Emulation Station is something called libretro, with various emulator cores for different systems. These are, yeah, they're interesting to tinker with. There's a bit of setting up involved. You need a micro SD card and you need to flash an image, in my case the latest RetroPie image, onto it, and then you need to put your game ROMs and also download some emulators themselves. But it's not too difficult to do. There's plenty of resources out there if you did get stuck, and I managed to get things up and running without too much trouble. Now, why have I got a Pi 3B and a Pi 4B? Because when I was emulating with the Pi 3B, one system in particular that I'm a huge fan of, and it's my all-time favourite video game system, the performance of the games in that emulator in particular, and anything in and around that sort of time, the Sony PlayStation I'm talking about here, the emulation performance was hit and miss. There were games that are quite straightforward in the PlayStation's library. For instance, Ridge Racer, which is early on in the PlayStation's life. And there was a lot of slowdown, and I mean a heck of a lot of slowdown, which when you play that game on real hardware, you don't get that slowdown. Same as other emulation devices, like for instance, if I play the PC and I use the Beetle PSX HW emulator with some nice graphical enhancements switched on, Ridge Racer runs really well. It doesn't slow down. But for some reason on the Pi 3B, it was running slowly. Now, one thing I never did with my Pi 3 was I never overclocked the device. So I know that's one thing people recommend because it gives you extra performance. And that's why we've got this Pi 4B decked out in this 3D printed case with a Noctua cooling fan on top of it, so that I can overclock this device pretty much to its maximum, but it will stay cool enough so that it won't switch off. You know, it won't shut down due to overheating. And it gives you that extra performance. And I thought, let's give this a go. And also, I've seen videos from people that know a lot more about this subject than me that show single board computers, lots of them, and they talk about emulation being one of the main key points that they show. And they always say about how these devices are fantastic, especially for playing PlayStation games. I remember seeing an article about how the Raspberry Pi, especially the 3B, is the absolute perfect way of playing PlayStation games if you don't want a PlayStation, but you'd like a little discrete device like this. And that it's better than the PlayStation Classic Edition, which, you know, to a point I agree it is. But I was extremely disappointed because the performance just isn't there. And even on straightforward games, it isn't there. So I thought, let's take things up a notch. Let's go for the Pi 4B. This is an evolution of the hardware. It's more powerful, it's more capable, and I've even overclocked it to boot. Now, a lot of these videos that I've seen, they'll show some games running. They'll even talk about how great the emulation performance is, especially with systems like the Sony PlayStation. Now, I'm going to go back to start with and say 8-bit systems like the NES and the Master System, the emulation is really good. It's really solid. 16-bit emulation, Mega Drive and Super Nintendo, on the whole, pretty good. Although the sound emulation on the Mega Drive, as is the case with a lot of emulators, it's still not right, and I can tell it's not, but that's just me, because I love the Mega Drive as well. It's another favourite console of mine. Arcade systems, again, arcade machines going up to the early 90s. No dramas running them on this. They seem to run quite nicely, and similarly on the Pi 3B as well. Things run pretty well. Home computer systems likewise, and I'd say these are a great way of running home computer systems like, you know, the Acorn Electron or the BBC Model B or the Commodore machines like the 64, the Vice emulator like the 128, the VIC-20, the Amiga machines, which Amiga is one of my all-time favourite home computers. These are really good for those because they handle that quite nicely. There's not really any issues with those. But expectations, you need to have realistic expectations when it comes to these devices. Now, Nintendo 64 on a Pi 3B, I'm going to put it to the side because it's a no-go. It is a no-go. Even people that have overclocked the Pi 3B, it just does not have the grunt to cope with N64. The performance of N64 games is very stuttery. It's not a good experience, it really isn't. There are some more straightforward and less technically demanding N64 games that will run okay. But yeah, I'm ruling that out. And unfortunately, even with an overclocked Raspberry Pi 4B, the experience is similar. It's slightly better, but it's a similar experience. You don't get smooth running N64 games that run similar to how they do on real hardware. It's a stuttery performing mess when it comes to emulating the N64. Now, let me move on to the main point of this video. Sony PlayStation. Unfortunately, the PlayStation emulation performance on this device is exactly the same as it is on the Pi 3B. Now, I'm not going to say that it's down to the Pis, because I think these two devices are more than capable of running Sony PlayStation emulation. Really good, solid PlayStation emulation. But the same issues that I had with the same games on the Pi 3B, exactly the same story on the Pi 4B. And I put that down to the LR PCSX rearmed emulator that's used with Emulation Station / libretro. I think that's the reason. I think a better PlayStation emulator would make those games run as they should. And it's a shame, because that was one of the things I was looking forward to, was having a lot of PS1 or PlayStation games loaded onto this and being able to sit down and play them, and, you know, maybe even tuck this away discreetly in my living room, leave it rigged up, because it wouldn't be an unwieldy sort of mess and an eyesore in my living room. It would have been quite nice. But unfortunately, it just does not perform well enough. Well, I say it doesn't perform well enough. The emulator doesn't perform well enough. The emulator lets it down, unfortunately. So, go into these with realistic expectations. They will run a lot of game systems and games very, very well indeed. But when you start getting to 32-bit machines, you know, mid to late 90s, they don't handle it so well. Either because it just doesn't have the grunt in the case of systems like the N64 and the Sega Saturn, or because the emulator in the case of the Sony PlayStation emulation, the LR PCSX rearmed, it just isn't a good enough emulator, unfortunately, and there are games that won't run correctly. Thank you for watching, guys. I hope you've enjoyed my waffle about the Raspberry Pi devices and using them as emulator boxes, and I will catch you again soon.